Hello, Aryeh. We are recording our podcast today in the midst of a new wave of violence in Israel as Palestinian attacks on Israel are mounting. These are terror attacks that have struck 3 times recent week and over 10 events in the last month, most of them with fatal casualties. Terror attacks that span all over Israel, from Beersheba in the south, Jerusalem, West Bank, and most recently in towns in the coastal area where people were murdered in the streets by knife attacks and gunshots from assault rifles that terrorists brought with them, or seized from casualties, some of them from security forces. So we're facing a new wave of terror. This is not the first time that Israel is such a wave. In fact, every couple of years, Israel is going through a wave like this. Sometimes it comes from the south, Gaza Strip. In other times, it came from the north, either in Hezbollah or supported Palestinian terror organizations in Lebanon or in Jordan, way back in the West Bank and Gaza. So Israeli security forces know how to deal with it. It just takes some time for fresh forces to get used to the situation, challenges, and to the ways to face them. The concepts of operations are known very well, but sometimes it takes time to implement them.
Tamir, as you mentioned, we are in the midst of a new wave of terror attacks in Israel. And this is not the first time we are living here from wave to wave. And the question is, can Israel counter those attacks? The answer is in the hands of our politicians. And our politicians are not brave enough or decisive enough to take the needed action. I give you an example. Some years ago, 10 years ago, even more, a separation fence was built between Israel and Judea and Samaria, the West Bank, to stop unauthorized entries of Palestinians into Israel and to force them to come to Israel through checkpoints. This fence is riddled with holes. You can drive a car during these holes in the fence. This is a bad joke. The government knows it. Everybody knows it. Today, the state controller mentioned that this is a very bad and dangerous situation. So Israel is not doing the right thing to stop these attacks for reasons that are not always based on facts or sense. The answer when the politicians are asked why this fence is not hermetic closed is to let people come to Israel to work and to decrease the economic pressure in Judea and Samaria and the West Bank. This is fine, but all the terrorists that in recent years performed terror attacks inside Israel came to Israel during these holes in the fence, which is, again, as I said, a very bad and dangerous joke. And another thing, the recent attacks were presented as performed by ISIS. I think this is a terminology that is misleading. All these attacks were performed by Palestinians from the West Bank without any connection, maybe a slight connection via social networks to ISIS. They are Palestinians that hate Jews and want to kill Jews in Israel. So the government must take severe steps to stop this wave. I don't see the government taking these steps. The politicians are giving interviews to a TV station, talking very high about what should be done, but not everything that has to be done is done. And this is a very dangerous situation because these attacks will continue and will cause the death of more Israelis.
If you remember, this fence was built in 2004 after many years of neglect that culminated in the 2002 terror attack on a Park Hotel in Netanya. 26 Jews in a Passover Seder were murdered in Netanya. That's when the operation to clear the West Bank from the terror cells began, and it lasted quite a long time. Back then it was the Prime Minister Ariel Sharon who was not the most politically conscious persona in Israel. In fact, he was in the last years of his life, so he felt he was doing what's right, not what is accepted. And he decided many very tough decisions. One of them was withdrawal from the Gaza Strip, move all the Israeli settlements from the Gaza Strip back into the Israeli border. So these were tough decisions. Most Israeli politicians don't take tough decisions. They go in the way of compromise of what's convenient to them, what's beneficial to them. They are very conscious about how they look and how they talk, mostly to their base. So if it's a left-wing government talking socialist language, and if it's a right-wing, they didn't want to create this fence because they did not want to separate the West Bank settlements from the Israeli border. So there is a lot of politics and much less security considerations involved in this. And the Palestinians are taking advantage of this. So they move weapons into Israel. We know now that hundreds of thousands of weapons, assault weapons, and guns and pistols are in the hands of Arab population. Most of them in the hands of people that are not the best law obedience. And for years, these weapons were pointed by the Arab at Arabs because they were kept mostly in their towns and villages. And in the recent months, these weapons are pointed also out of the villages, either on the roads and now in the Jewish cities. So the situation is not good. It takes decisive actions to counter it and to turn the tide. I hope that the Israeli government will be decisive enough and tough enough to implement what's needed in order to bring back the security and solve these situations once and for all.
Yes, I think you're right. The Israeli government should take some tough decisions, but these decisions are needed to protect the life of Israelis around Israel. And I hope that this time they will think about operational decision and not about politics and how it looks to people in Israel or outside Israel. So we will continue to monitor the situation and will update you in one of our next podcasts. Thank you, Tamir.